The first one broke before the hall lights had even cycled to full luminance. Vesk Tolenrai watched it happen from the third row of bunks, his secondary eyelids half closed against the cold blue glare of the barracks ceiling. Cadet Inorath, a Velisi, broad-shouldered, built like a siege column, was standing at attention in the center aisle when the tremor started in his lower mandible. A twitch, then a full ripple through his jaw plates, cracking the careful stillness the way a stone cracks ice. The Velisi's hands came up, his gills fluttered. And then a sound came out of him that Vesk had only ever heard in medical archives. A full cortisol harmonic wail, the involuntary distress cry of a species that had evolved to signal pack members when a predator had them pinned. Nobody came. Senior Instructor Gale Torvinen stood 2 meters away, arms folded across the thick cartilage of his chest, his face carrying the same expression it had carried since the intake formation 6 hours ago. Nothing. Not contempt. Not satisfaction. Just the flat professional patience of someone who had watched this particular scene play out 1,000 times and no longer found it interesting. Cadet Inorath, Torvinen said. His voice was low. It didn't carry emotion. It carried weight. Step to the wall, collect your transit authorization from the quartermaster. You are dismissed from the Kethara Proving. The Velisi didn't argue, he didn't beg. The wail cut off as abruptly as it had started, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse, and Inorath walked to the barracks door with his kit bag dragging from one hand, his mandible still trembling, his broad back shrinking as the corridor swallowed him. That was the first. Vesk pulled his thermal sheet higher and pressed his spine into the thin mattress pad. Around him, 46 cadets occupied identical bunks in identical postures, most of them awake, most of them pretending not to be. The barracks smelled of stress pheromones from at least 9 different species, layered into a cocktail that made Vesk's chemoreceptors ache. Somewhere in the far row, a Druvan was clicking her mandibles in a rhythm that meant she was running a calculation loop, her species equivalent of anxious prayer. 6 hours. They had been in the Kethara Proving Grounds for 6 hours, and already one was gone. The proving was not an exam. Vesk's briefing packet had been clear about that. There were no scores, no rankings, no individual assessments during the opening phase. The first 48 hours were called the Sieve, and they were designed to do exactly what the name suggested, separate material that held from material that didn't. The Sieve did not test knowledge. It did not test combat skill or tactical acumen. It tested one thing, and every species in the coalition knew what that thing was, even if the official documentation never named it directly. It tested whether you could be broken. And if you could, the Kethara Proving would break you early, because the alternative breaking in the field, breaking on a live operation, breaking in a way that killed the people standing next to you, was a cost the coalition had decided it could no longer afford. Vesk understood this. He had understood it when he applied. He was Kethrasi, born on a station world with 0.87 standard gravity and a 22-hour light cycle, and his species had been producing coalition officers for 11 generations. His mother had survived the proving. His father had not. Neither fact changed his decision to enter. What he had not expected was the human. She was in the bunk directly across the aisle from his. 4th row, left side, rack number 411. Vesk had memorized the layout within the first hour. It was a Kethrasi habit, spatial orientation as anxiety management, and the human had registered in his awareness the way a wrong color registers in a pattern. She was small. Not small by human standards. Perhaps Vesk's xenobiology training was limited, but small by the standards of the 47 other species filling these bunks. Her shoulders were narrow. Her limbs were smooth and unarmored. She had no mandible plates, no dermal plating, no secondary eyelids, no visible claws. Her hair was dark and pulled back from her face in a tight knot, and her skin was a warm brown that caught the barracks light differently than any other surface in the room, softer, less reflective, almost absorbent. Her name, according to the intake roster Vesk had glimpsed during processing, was Kes Marin. She was asleep. Not pretending to sleep. Not lying still with her eyes closed and her muscles locked rigid the way Vesk was. Actually asleep. Breathing slow and deep, her face turned slightly toward the ceiling, one hand resting on her sternum with the fingers loosely curled. The thermal sheet was pulled up to her collarbone. Her expression carried nothing, no tension, no watchfulness, no chemical signature of suppressed alertness. Just the absolute neurological vacancy of a mammalian brain that had decided the day was over. Vesk's secondary eyelids cycled open. He stared at her for a long time. She had done nothing remarkable during intake. She had stood in formation with the rest of them. She had collected her kit bag, her bunk assignment, her uniform. She had eaten the ration packet they were given, all of it, methodically, without complaint or commentary, while most of the other cadets were still trying to identify whether the compressed nutrient block was food or insulation foam. She had changed into sleepwear and climbed into her bunk and closed her eyes, and the entire process had taken her less than 4 minutes. Now the sieve was grinding through the barracks, cracking open the first weak points, and Kes Marin was sleeping through it. Vesk didn't know what to make of that. The second dismissal came 40 minutes later. A Druvan named Ikikit, whose clicking had grown louder and more erratic as the minutes dragged on, finally snapped her mandibles so hard that the left one cracked audibly, spraying a fine mist of hemolymph across her bunk. The medical drone arrived in 14 seconds. Torvanen arrived in 12. The diagnosis was self-inflicted stress fracture. The transit authorization was issued before the hemolymph had finished drying on the sheets. Ikikit walked out under her own power, her cracked mandible sealed with surgical adhesive, her compound eyes wet and blank. She did not look at anyone as she passed. Kes Marin did not wake up. The third and fourth went together at the start of the second hour. Twin Vorethi clutch siblings, their dossiers said, who had applied to the proving as a bonded pair. The Sieve had a specific protocol for bonded entrants. Separate them. Put them in different barracks, different formations, different feeding rotations. Break the bond's comfort loop and see what was underneath. The Vorethi twins had lasted exactly 1 hour and 47 minutes apart before the junior one began emitting subsonic distress pulses that resonated through the barracks walls. Vesk felt it in his jaw. 2 bunks over, a Kelshani cadet pressed her palms over her auditory slits and hissed. The pulses intensified. They didn't stop until both Vorethi were escorted out, side by side, their bonding tendrils wrapped around each other's forearms. 5 and 6 were quiet. Arashini, who simply stood up, folded her thermal sheet with mechanical precision and walked to the door without a word. A Grelian, whose bioluminescent chromatophores had been cycling through panic colors for the past 90 minutes, jade to violet to white, jade to violet to white, and who finally dimmed to a flat, exhausted gray, and admitted to the attending drone that he could not stop the cycling and his reserves were depleted. Torvanen dismissed them both with the same inflectionless phrase, "Collect your transit authorization from the quartermaster." 7 was loud. A Tenthuri cadet, one of the larger species, thickly muscled, evolved on a high-gravity world, stood up on his bunk, bellowed a challenge call that rattled the overhead light fixtures, and declared that the Sieve was an insult to his bloodline, and that he would not submit to being broken by silence and cold and thin mattresses. Torvanen looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he said, "You are not being broken by silence. You are being broken by yourself. Transit authorization. Quartermaster." The Tenthuri left. The barracks was quieter after that. Vesk counted. 7 gone. 40 cadets remained. The ceiling lights had not changed. The temperature had not changed. Nothing in the physical environment had changed at all. The Sieve was not doing anything to them. It was simply letting them do things to themselves and waiting. He pulled his gaze back to bunk 411. Kes Marin had turned onto her side. Her breathing hadn't changed. Her hand was now tucked under her cheek, and in the cold blue light her face looked impossibly still, like a stone at the bottom of a clear stream, settled and smooth and unbothered by the current above. The 8th dismissal happened at the 4-hour mark. A young Pelvori cadet named Suvan Vesk had spoken to him briefly during intake, found him nervous but earnest, sat up in his bunk and began to cry. Not the distress wail of the Velisi, not the cracking mandible of the Druvan, just tears. Clear fluid running down his smooth gray face, while his thin chest hitched, and his four-fingered hands gripped his thermal sheet so hard the fabric tore. Torvanen walked to his bunk. He did not touch him, he did not speak loudly. "Cadet Suvan." "I know," the Pelvori's voice was small, "I know what comes next. Do you want to make the walk yourself, or do you want the drone?" Suvan made the walk himself. As he passed bunk 411, his foot caught on the edge of the aisle runner and he stumbled. His kit bag hit the ground. The contents scattered: a hygiene kit, a spare uniform sleeve, a small pressed crystal that Vesk recognized as a Pelvori devotional anchor, the kind families gave to their children when they left home for the first time. The crystal skittered across the floor and came to rest against the base of Kes Marin's bunk. Vesk expected the human to sleep through it. He expected Suvan to collect his things with shaking hands and disappear down the corridor like the others. Neither of those things happened. Kes Marin's eyes opened. Not slowly, not groggily, not with the disoriented blinking of someone pulled from deep sleep. Her eyes opened the way a weapon's safety disengages, one clean motion, full awareness, no transition. She looked at Suvan. She looked at the scattered kit. She looked at the crystal on the floor. Then she sat up, swung her legs off the bunk and bent down. She picked up the crystal. She picked up the hygiene kit and the spare sleeve. She repacked the bag with quick, efficient hands, tucking the crystal into the interior pocket where it wouldn't shift. Then she stood and held the bag out to Suvan. "You'll want this on the transport," she said. Her voice was low and even, not warm exactly, not cold, just the voice of someone stating a fact that didn't require emotional ornamentation. The pressed ones crack if they rattle around loose. Suvan stared at her. His gray face was still wet. His four-fingered hands closed around the bag strap, and for a moment he stood there, looking at the human with an expression Vesk could not decode: gratitude, maybe, or bewilderment, or the raw shock of encountering something gentle in a place designed to strip gentleness away. "Thank you," Suvan said. Kes Marin nodded once. She sat back down on her bunk. She did not lie down immediately. Instead, she looked across the aisle, directly at Vesk, and he realized with a cold shock that she knew he'd been watching her, that she had probably known the entire time. Her expression gave him nothing. No challenge, no camaraderie, no plea for acknowledgement. She just looked at him the way you look at a window when you want to check whether it's raining, briefly, practically, with no more significance than the information required. Then she lay back down and closed her eyes. Vesk did not sleep at all that night. The 9th dismissal came in the 5th hour. Another Rashini, this one older, who had been running subvocal mantra loops since intake. The mantras stopped mid-syllable, replaced by a silence that lasted exactly 11 seconds before the cadet stood up and walked to the door. No words, no ceremony, just a decision reached and executed. 10 and 11 were a pair of Kelshani who had been assigned to adjacent bunks and had been communicating through their auditory slits in frequencies below the range of most species present. Whatever they had been saying to each other, it ended at the same time, and they left together, their elongated skulls bowed, their slitted eyes fixed on the floor. 12 was the one that almost broke Vesk. Cadet Jorantai was Kethara, same species as Vesk, same station world origin, same .87G physiology, same secondary eyelids, same chemoreceptor array. They had recognized each other during intake, not acquaintances, but kin in the broader sense, two members of a species that produced coalition officers the way some worlds produced grain. There was an unspoken expectation between them, a shared understanding that Kethara endured. That Kethara did not break during the Sieve, because 11 generations of officers had built a reputation on exactly that kind of endurance. Jorantai broke in the 6th hour. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't wail or crack or bellow. He simply sat up, looked at the barracks ceiling with both sets of eyelids fully open and said, "I don't want to become what this makes." Torvinen appeared beside his bunk. The senior instructor's face was as blank as it had been for the first dismissal. "Clarify, Cadet." "I've been watching." Jorantai's voice was steady, which made it worse. 6 hours, 12 species, the same pattern. You wait for the first crack and then you remove the piece before it can contaminate the set. That's the design. And the ones who stay, the ones who pass the sieve, they pass because they learn not to crack. They learn to hold still while the person next to them breaks. They learn that the correct response to suffering is to not respond. He looked at Torvinen with a directness that made Vesk's chemoreceptors flare with borrowed adrenaline. "I don't want to learn that," Jorantai said. "I came here to protect people, not to practice being stone while they fall apart next to me." Torvinen was silent for 5 full seconds. Then he said, "Transit authorization, Quartermaster." Jorantai stood. He collected his kit with the careful, unhurried motions of someone who had made peace with a decision. As he passed Vesk's bunk, their secondary eyelids met the Kethara equivalent of eye contact, stripped of all social filtering, raw and involuntary. Vesk felt the question in his own chest like a physical weight. Is he right? Jorantai walked out. The barracks door sealed behind him, and the question stayed, sitting on Vesk's sternum like a stone, pressing harder with every breath. He looked across the aisle. Kesmarin was sitting up in her bunk. She was awake, had been awake, Vesk realized, since the Pelvori's crystal hit the floor. She was looking at the sealed door where Jorantai had disappeared, and for the first time since intake, her face was carrying an expression Vesk could read. It was not agreement. It was not disagreement. It was recognition, the kind of look someone gives a thought they've had themselves, a long time ago, in a place that didn't allow the luxury of acting on it. Then it was gone. Her face reset to the same neutral stillness, and she turned back to her bunk and pulled the thermal sheet up and lay down. But she didn't close her eyes. She lay there on her back, staring at the ceiling, and Vesk understood in that moment that the human was doing something none of the others had done. She was thinking. Not panicking, not calculating odds of survival, not running mantra loops or distress harmonics. She was thinking about what Jorantai had said, actually thinking about it. The way you think about something that matters, turning it over, testing its edges, deciding what to do with it. And then she made her decision, and she closed her eyes, and she went back to sleep. The sieve ground on. By the time the barracks lights shifted to dawn cycle luminance, a gradual warming from blue to amber that signaled the end of the first 12 hours, 12 cadets were gone. 40 remained. Torvinen had not raised his voice once. He had not threatened anyone, struck anyone, insulted anyone. He had simply been present, the same way the cold was present and the thin mattresses were present, and the smell of 9 species fear was present, and he had waited for the cracks to show. And when they showed, he had removed the cracked pieces with the same emotionless efficiency a surgeon uses to remove dead tissue. The 12 bunks sat empty, their thermal sheets still rumpled, their kit bags gone. Small absences that added up to a geography of failure. Vesk sat on the edge of his bunk and tried to feel something definitive. Pride that he had lasted. Shame for the ones who hadn't. The residual weight of Jorantai's words. Instead, he felt a formless exhaustion that wasn't physical. His body was fine. His vitals nominal. His hydration adequate but cognitive. As if the act of witnessing 12 breakdowns in 12 hours had depleted some internal resource, he didn't have a name for. Formation in the yard, 3 minutes. Torvanin's voice cut through the barracks like a blade. 40 cadets moved. Bunks were squared. Uniforms were donned. Bodies filed toward the corridor in a silence that felt fundamentally different from the silence of the night, thicker, more deliberate, the silence of people who had learned what sound could cost. Vesk fell into the column. The corridor was long and featureless, white composite walls under strip lighting, and the cadets moved through it in 2 lines with the mechanical discipline of people who had not been taught to march, but understood that this was not the time to walk casually. Kethara was 4 places ahead of him in the left column. She moved the way she did everything without apparent effort, without commentary, without drawing attention to the fact that her stride was shorter than anyone else's in the formation, but her pace was exactly on beat. She had donned her uniform in under 90 seconds. Vesk had been tracking her peripherally. He couldn't help it. The human was the only variable in the barracks that he couldn't predict, and the Kethara part of his brain, the spatial mapping, pattern recognizing, threat assessing part, had locked onto her the way it would lock onto a heat signature that didn't match the background. The training yard was immense, open air by design, roofed with a transparent kinetic barrier that let the sky through but kept the weather out. The Kethara Proving Grounds sat on a high-gravity border moon with a thin atmosphere and a pale blue sun, and the light that filtered through the barrier was cold and sharp, casting hard shadows on the composite deck. 40 cadets formed 4 ranks of 10. Torvanin stood at the front, flanked by 2 junior instructors Vesk hadn't seen before, a Kelshani with prosthetic auditory slits, and a Druvan whose mandibles bore the distinctive notching of combat service. "You survived the night," Torvanin said. He didn't make it sound like a compliment. "The next phase begins now, physical conditioning. You will be told what to do. You will do it until you are told to stop. The parameters are not designed for your species. They are designed for the field. The field does not accommodate species." He let that settle. "Begin." The first exercise was a loaded carry. Each cadet was issued a standard mass pack, 30 kilograms coalition standard, unadjusted for species or body weight, and instructed to hold it at arm's length overhead for as long as possible. For the tenthuri, the Velasi, the high-gravity species, 30 kilograms was noticeable but manageable. For the Kethara station bred, 0.87 g adapted, it was significant. Vesk felt the weight settle into his shoulders and push down through his spine and into the deck, and he locked his arms and focused on keeping his secondary eyelids open, because closing them was a stress response and stress responses were visible, and visibility was vulnerability. For the human, 30 kilograms at overhead arm extension should have been catastrophic. Vesk had reviewed the species briefings. Humans were classified as mid-range endurance bipeds with moderate strength relative to mass nowhere near the top of the physical spectrum. Their arms were not built for sustained overhead loads. Their shoulders were a compromised design, evolved for throwing and climbing, not for static holds. Kethara lifted the pack overhead and held it there. Her arms did not shake. Her face did not change. She stood in the 3rd rank, wedged between a Velasi whose arm plates were already trembling, and a Rashini whose lower joints had begun to audibly click, and she held the pack at full extension with the calm, focused stillness of someone performing a task she had performed 10,000 times before. The first cadet dropped at 4 minutes. A slim Pelvori whose arms simply folded, the pack hitting the deck with a flat, heavy sound. The cadet looked at the pack, then at Torvanin, and there was a moment where the trajectory was obvious: the transit authorization, the walk to the quartermaster, the corridor, the transport home. But Torvanin didn't dismiss the Pelvori. He looked at her and said, "Pick it up." She picked it up. The carry continued. Vesk's arms began to burn at 6 minutes. The Kethara physiology had its own limits. 0.87 g meant lighter bones, efficient muscles, but less raw power per fiber than species bred under real gravity. He held the pack and felt the burn climb from his deltoids into his trapezius and spread across his back like a slow fire, and he breathed through it the way his mother had taught him: 4 counts in, 4 counts out, focus on the exhalation, let the pain exist without reacting to it. At 8 minutes, another cadet dropped, then 2 more. The packs hit the deck like punctuation marks, and each time Torvinen gave the same instruction: pick it up. Nobody was dismissed. Nobody was told to stop. The exercise just continued, the clock just ran, and the only question was how many times you could drop and pick up and hold and drop again before the instructor said the word that meant it was over. At 12 minutes, Vesk's right arm buckled, the pack shifted. He caught it with his left hand, his chemoreceptors firing alarm signals that tasted like copper and ozone. And for 3 terrible seconds he was certain he was going to lose it entirely, and the pack was going to come down on his skull and crack his secondary eyelid housing. He looked across the formation. Kes Marin was still holding the pack overhead. 14 minutes now. Her arms were locked. Her face was set in an expression that wasn't strain, exactly more like deep attention, the kind of focus someone gives a task that requires their full participation but not their full capacity. Her forearms were trembling. Vesk could see it, the fine, rapid vibration of human muscle fibers under sustained load, a physiological response she couldn't suppress. But the pack wasn't moving. The trembling was in the tissue, not in the task. At 16 minutes, Torvinen said, down. Packs hit the deck. 40 thuds, some of them ragged, dropped from failing grips, some controlled. Kes Marin's pack came down in a smooth arc, lowered, not dropped, and she set it on the deck in front of her feet and stood with her hands at her sides and her breathing elevated but steady. Vesk lowered his pack and tried to feel his shoulders. The nerve channels were screaming. His secondary eyelids were cycling involuntarily, a stress response he couldn't control and couldn't hide. The next exercise was worse, and the one after that was worse than the one before it. The physical conditioning block ran for 4 hours, loaded carries, sprint intervals on the high-gravity deck, crawls under kinetic barrier obstacles set at species minimum height, wall climbs on surfaces textured for clawed grip that the human had to negotiate with bare fingers. Vesk watched her climb. He watched her adapt. Every obstacle was designed for a physiology that wasn't hers, the grip surfaces shaped for talons, the crawl heights calibrated for low-profile species, the sprint distances set for stride lengths she didn't possess, and she didn't complain. She didn't ask for accommodation. She assessed each obstacle with the same quick, practical scan, eyes moving, hands testing, body adjusting, and then she solved it. Not gracefully, not elegantly. Not the way the Tenthuri solved the wall climb, with raw power, or the way the Kelshani solved the crawl, with fluid spinal flexibility. She solved it like an engineer. She found the inefficiency in the design, the gap between intended difficulty and actual physics, and she threaded through it. The grip surfaces weren't shaped for human hands, but human hands could hook fingertips over edges that talon species bypassed. The crawl heights were set for low-profile thoraxes, but the human torso could compress and flatten in ways that rigid carapaces couldn't. The sprint distances favored long strides, but the human's shorter stride meant higher cadence, and higher cadence meant more contact time with the high-gravity deck, and more contact time meant better traction. She wasn't the fastest, she wasn't the strongest, she wasn't the most efficient on any single exercise, but she never stopped. She never dropped out. She never stood at the base of an obstacle and asked what she was supposed to do with a body that wasn't built for this. She just did it. And Vesk, who had been raised on 11 generations of Ketharasi endurance, who had been taught since birth that his species' gift was persistence, found himself falling behind her. Not physically. His conditioning was adequate, his performance well within the Ketharasi average, his times and carries and climbs all placing him comfortably in the upper third of the formation. He was not failing. He was not struggling in any way that the metrics would capture. But something else was happening. Something he didn't have language for. He was watching the human the way you watch a flame in a dark room, not because the flame is threatening, but because it's the only thing moving, and the movement itself rewrites the scale of everything around it. She was smaller. She was weaker. She was physiologically disadvantaged on every measurable axis, and she was present in a way that the larger, stronger, better-equipped species around her were not. Present the way a heartbeat is present, constant, unremarkable, and impossible to ignore once you've noticed it. The afternoon brought the classroom block. 4 hours of tactical theory, species psychology, operational law. The cadets sat in a tiered amphitheater with individual data terminals, and the Kelshani junior instructor, the one with the prosthetic auditory slits, delivered a lecture on multi-species unit cohesion that was dense, precise, and delivered at a pace that assumed you were either keeping up or falling behind. Vesk kept up. He was Keith Rossi. Academic retention was a species strength. He absorbed the information in clean sequential blocks, cross-referenced it with his existing training, and filed it in the pattern map his brain maintained automatically. Around him, other cadets were visibly struggling. The Velasi, whose cognitive architecture favored spatial reasoning over verbal processing, were particularly strained, their mandibles clicking in frustration as the lecture outpaced their ability to notate. Kes Marin sat in the second row. She had a stylus and a data pad, and she was writing. Not typing, writing, her hand moving across the surface in quick, looping strokes that Vesk recognized after a moment as a written script. Human written script, not the standardized coalition data entry system that every cadet had been trained on. A personal notation system, manual, analog, and Vesk, realized with a start approximately 3 times faster than the data entry method the rest of them were using. She was writing with her hand, on a data pad designed for stylus-tip input, and she was keeping pace with the lecture without apparent effort, her eyes moving between the instructor and her pad in a rhythm that suggested she was not just recording but processing, filtering, condensing, restructuring the information as it arrived. The Kelshani instructor paused mid-lecture. She looked at Kes Marin's data pad. Her prosthetic slits adjusted a focusing gesture, the Kelshani equivalent of narrowing one's eyes. Cadet Marin. Instructor. Your notation method is not standard. No, instructor. Why? Kes Marin looked up from her pad. Her face was neutral. It's faster. The Kelshani instructor regarded her for 2 seconds. Then she said, "Continue," and resumed the lecture. No one else commented. But Vesk saw 3 cadets in adjacent seats glance at Marin's pad, and he saw the expressions they carried back to their own screens, not hostility, not admiration, but the uncomfortable recalibration of someone who has just learned that the thing they thought was the standard was someone else's starting point. The evening meal was in the refectory, a large, low-ceilinged room with communal tables and a dispensary wall that produced species-calibrated ration blocks. The cadets sat by formation group, and the atmosphere was the particular kind of exhaustion that comes after a day designed to teach you how much further you have to go. Vesk sat across from a Velasi named Drayan Saul, who had barely spoken since intake and who was eating her ration block with the methodical focus of someone refueling a machine. 2 seats down, a Grelian whose chromatophores were cycling in slow, tired patterns was staring at his food as if it might contain answers. Kes Marin sat at the end of the table. She had collected her ration block in a hydration canister, and she was eating in the same way she did everything, steadily, practically, without waste motion or social performance. She did not attempt conversation. She did not avoid eye contact. She simply ate, and when she was finished she sat with her hands folded on the table and waited for the meal period to end. Vesk found himself speaking before he'd made the conscious decision to do so. "You slept through the sieve." Marin looked at him. Her eyes were dark brown, a color that didn't exist in Kethara biology, warm and opaque and giving nothing back. "Yes," she said. 12 cadets were dismissed. You didn't wake up for any of them." "I woke up for the Pelvori." "For one." One was enough. She picked up her hydration canister and drank, set it down. The sieve wasn't designed to test whether you can stay awake while other people break. It was designed to test whether you can sleep, whether you can look at the environment, assess the actual threat level, and decide that the correct response is to rest. Because in the field, the person who stays awake all night watching people fail is the person who's too exhausted to function when the real problem arrives. Vesk's secondary eyelids closed, both sets, an involuntary response to information that restructured an existing pattern. "You slept because you chose to." "I slept because there was nothing to do. The barracks was secure. The temperature was stable. The threat was psychological, not physical. The most tactically sound response to a psychological endurance test is to not engage." She said it the way she'd said everything else, flatly, without smugness, without the tone of someone delivering wisdom to a student. She was describing what she'd done the way a mechanic describes a repair. Here was the problem, here was the tool, here was the result. Vesk looked at her for a long time. His chemoreceptors were reading something from her, not the stress pheromones that saturated the rest of the refectory, not the copper ozone tang of exhaustion or the sour edge of suppressed fear. Something else. Something his receptor array didn't have a label for, because it had never encountered it in this concentration before. It took him until lights out to identify it. It was calm. Not the absence of stress, not the suppression of anxiety. Calm, the actual neurochemical state, the baseline that a nervous system returns to when it is not under threat. Marin's body was producing the chemical signature of a person who was safe, rested, and operating within normal parameters. In the Kethara Proving Grounds, in the middle of the sieve, surrounded by 40 cadets who were each managing their own private architecture of fear. She was calm because she was not afraid. And Vesk, lying in his bunk with his secondary eyelids sealed and his chemoreceptors burning with borrowed adrenaline, understood for the first time what his xenobiology briefings had failed to convey. The briefings had described human physiology, endurance capacity, thermoregulatory range, pain tolerance thresholds, dietary flexibility. They had presented humans as a mid-range species with some notable adaptive advantages: social bonding, tool use, endurance predation heritage, pattern recognition. What the briefings had not described, what no briefing could describe, because it wasn't a measurable trait but an emergent property of the entire organism, was the thing that Vesk was watching. Humans had been broken before. That was the insight. That was the thing the sieve couldn't reach. Not broken by the proving, not broken by alien institutions or foreign curricula or unfamiliar gravity, broken by their own world, by the ice ages and the famines and the plagues and the wars that their species had dragged itself through for 100,000 years before they ever left their planet's atmosphere. Earth was not a garden. It was a crucible, and the crucible had already done what the Kethara Proving was trying to do. It had tested whether they could break, and the ones who had survived were the ones who couldn't. Marin did not sleep through the sieve because she was arrogant. She slept through it because she had already passed it, a long time ago, on a world that made the Kethara Proving Grounds feel like a waiting room. And now she was here in the barracks, in the bunk across the aisle, small and unarmored and impossible to predict, and Vesk felt something shift in his chest, a feeling that was not fear and not admiration, and not the calculated respect of one professional assessing another. It was wonder. Alienated wonder. The specific, vertigo-inducing recognition that you are sharing a room with something you do not fully understand, and that your failure to understand it is not a problem you can solve by studying harder. The gap between what the briefings described and what Kes Marin actually was could not be bridged by data. It could only be crossed by watching her sleep, watching her eat, watching her hold a 30-kilogram pack overhead while her forearms trembled and her face held steady, watching her pick up a Pelvori Cadet's devotional crystal and tuck it into his bag with hands that knew exactly where the crystal belonged. Vesk had entered the Kethara Proving Grounds expecting to be tested. He had not expected the test to be a person. The second night of the Sieve was when the quiet ones went. Not the ones who cracked loudly, not the ones whose biology betrayed them with wails and fractured mandibles. The ones who lay perfectly still in their bunks, performing composure, holding their bodies in check through pure will, and then, sometime between the 24th and the 30th hour, simply stopped. One moment they were present. The next they were standing at the barracks door with their kit bags, faces empty, eyes unfocused, as if the decision to leave had been made somewhere below the level of conscious thought and they were merely executing it. Cadet 13 was a Pelvori not Suvan, a different one older, with the ridge scarring that indicated prior military service in a planetary guard. She had shown no signs of distress. She had eaten her ration. She had spoken to the drone during the mandatory wellness check and answered every question correctly. Then at the 27th hour she stood up, put her boots on, and walked to the door without collecting her kit bag at all. Torvinen stopped her. "Your bag, Cadet." She looked back at it, looked at Torvinen. "I don't need anything from this place." She left. 14 was a Grelian who had been cycling pale green, the stable color, the safe color for 17 hours straight, an impressive display of chromatophore control. Then the green flickered, just once, a single pulse of deep violet that lasted less than a second. The Grelian stared at his own arms, watching the violet recede, and when the green came back it was a shade lighter than before, thinner. He cycled for another 40 minutes, each green a fraction paler, each flicker of violet a fraction longer, until the ratio inverted and he was cycling violet to green instead of green to violet, and then he was cycling solid violet, and then he was walking to the door. 15 was quiet enough that Vesk missed it entirely, an empty bunk where a Rashini had been, no memory of the departure, just an absence clean and complete. 16 came at the 31st hour, and this one Vesk felt in his own chest. A Kethrasi, not Jorantai was already gone. This was Revel Asunko, a female from a different station world, someone Vesk had exchanged exactly 2 sentences with during intake. She had seemed steady, composed, Kethrasi standard. She broke differently than Jorantai had. No speech, no philosophical objection. She simply sat up in her bunk and began to cry, a response so atypical for Kethrasi biology that Vesk initially misidentified it as a fluid leak in her secondary eyelid housing. Kethrasi did not cry. The species had evolved on low-humidity station worlds where fluid loss was a survival liability. The tear ducts existed but were vestigial, non-functional under normal conditions. Revel Asunko's tear ducts were functioning. The stress had driven her physiology past its design parameters and activated a system that her species had discarded 1,000 generations ago. She was crying with organs that had forgotten how, and the tears came out wrong, too thick, slightly clouded, running in uneven channels down her face because the lacrimal grooves were atrophied and couldn't guide the flow. Vesk watched it happen and felt something inside himself shift, a hairline fracture in his own composure, thin as a thread, located in the exact place where species pride lived. 2 Kethrasi down, out of 3 who had entered. He was the only one left. Torvinen issued the transit authorization. Revel Asunko collected her bag and walked out, and the tears were still coming, and they were still wrong. And Vesk sealed his secondary eyelids and pressed his face into the mattress, and held very still until the tremor in his hands passed. When he opened his eyelids again, Kesmarin was looking at him. Not at the door where Revel had disappeared. At him. The human's expression was unreadable, or rather, it was readable in a way that Vesk's emotional taxonomy didn't have a category for. It was not pity. It was not evaluation. It was something closer to acknowledgement, a look that said, simply, I see that this cost you something. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she lay back down and closed her eyes. The Sieve ended after 48 hours with 31 cadets remaining out of the original 47. The physical conditioning intensified. The classroom blocks grew denser. The junior instructors rotated in specialists who taught combat medicine, field engineering, xenolinguistic signaling, operational ethics, each block faster than the last, each assessment less forgiving, each day a pressure gradient that climbed toward a ceiling nobody could see. Day 3 introduced the integration drills, multi-species exercises designed to force cadets into cooperative problem-solving under physical duress. The premise was straightforward. Complete a tactical objective while carrying a load under time pressure, with a team composed of species whose physiologies were fundamentally incompatible. Vesk's team was assigned a navigation problem. 3-kilometer route through the Proving Grounds, exterior terrain, exposed rock, uneven gravity pockets, no visibility aids. The team consisted of Vesk, Drayan Sol the Velisi, a Tenthuri named Cal, a Rashini named Sieve, and Kesmarin. The terrain was punishing. The gravity pockets were irregular, some dropped to 0.6 standard, some spiked to 1.4, and the transitions were unmarked. The Tenthuri struggled in the low-gravity zones, his dense musculature working against him, each step launching him higher than intended. The Rashini struggled in the high-gravity zones, her light-framed skeleton bowing under the additional load. Vesk managed the transitions competently. Keith Rossi, spatial mapping, helped him read the gradient changes before they hit, but the constant recalibration was draining his cognitive reserves faster than the physical effort was draining his body. Kesmarin walked through the gravity pockets as if they were weather. Not unaffected, Vesk could see her adjusting, her stance widening in the heavy zones, her stride shortening in the light ones, but unperturbed. The adjustments were automatic, reflexive, the kind of motor adaptation that only develops through prolonged exposure to variable gravitational environments. But the thing Vesk noticed, the thing that made him pause mid-stride and stare, was what she did at the transition boundaries. The places where the gravity changed, where the other cadets stumbled or overcorrected. Marin hit those boundaries, felt the shift, and then without slowing down, without looking back, she called out the change. Point 8 ahead 2 meters. Spike coming, 1.3, hold your line. Dropping to 0.6, short steps. She was calling the terrain, navigating for the team. Not because anyone asked her to, not because the exercise required it, but because she could feel the changes an instant before the others, and the information was useful and sharing it cost her nothing. Cal the Tenthuri, who had been struggling badly, began timing his stride to Marin's calls. His performance improved immediately. Save the Rashini braced before each spike instead of absorbing it cold. Drayan Sol adjusted her mandible clamps to prevent stress cracking during the transitions. The team's overall pace increased by roughly 15%. Torvinen was watching from a monitoring station. Vesk saw his data pad flicker as he made a note. The senior instructor's face remained blank, but the note existed, and Vesk understood what it meant. The exercise had been designed to test individual performance under cooperative pressure. The human had turned it into a demonstration of something else entirely. That night, Torvinen introduced the endurance march. No announcement. No briefing. At 2200, 30 minutes after lights out, the barracks door slammed open and the senior instructor stood in the frame and said 3 words. Formation. Full kit. 31 cadets scrambled. Vesk was on his feet and pulling on his boots before his conscious mind had fully engaged. Around him, the barracks was a chaos of motion, velocity, grunting as they sealed their mandible clamps, Grellians cycling from sleep gray to stress amber. The 10th Cal trying to compress his bulk into his kit harness with fingers that were shaking from the day's exertion. Marin was ready first. Not by a dramatic margin, 7 seconds ahead of the nearest cadet, but the 7 seconds mattered because she spent them standing in the aisle, watching the formation assemble, her kit squared, her posture settled, her face carrying the expression of someone who had known this was coming. Vesk realized, as he shouldered his pack and fell into the column, that she probably had. The humans had been doing this for thousands of years. Of course they taught their recruits to sleep in a state that could be broken instantly. Of course they trained their muscles to remember the boot sequence even when the brain was still surfacing. Of course the sound of a door slamming open at 2200 was not an emergency to a human, it was just the next part of the curriculum. The march covered 8 kilometers of exterior terrain in full darkness. No light augmentation. No nav aids. The sky above the kinetic barrier was a smear of unfamiliar stars. Vesk's station world constellations were not visible from this latitude, and the footing was broken rock and compressed regolith that shifted under weight in the variable gravity. 3 cadets fell in the first kilometer. Not dismissed, fallen, physically, their boots catching on unseen edges, their packs throwing them off balance as the gravity pockets played havoc with their center of mass. The Druvan instructor brought up the rear and hauled them upright and shoved them back into the column without comment. Vesk navigated by spatial mapping. His Ketharasi brain built a running model of the terrain from each footfall's tactile feedback, gradient, texture, density, angle, and projected the next 3 steps before he took them. It worked. He stayed upright. He maintained pace. But the cognitive load was immense, and by the 3rd kilometer he could feel the model's resolution degrading, the predictions becoming coarser, the margin between a clean step and a fall narrowing with each minute. Marin navigated differently. She didn't predict, she reacted. Each step was its own complete event, foot down, weight assessed, balance adjusted, next step. No model, no projection, no attempt to impose order on chaotic terrain. She moved through the dark the way a liquid moves through a pipe, filling whatever shape the moment presented, wasting no energy on anticipation, accepting each irregularity as it arrived and adapting to it in the fraction of a second between contact and commitment. It was, Vesk realized, the most efficient locomotion pattern he had ever seen. Not because it was fast, it wasn't. Not because it was graceful, it wasn't that either. It was efficient because it assumed nothing. His Ketharasi spatial mapping was powerful, but it required processing power, and it failed when the terrain exceeded the model's parameters. Marin's approach had no parameters. It couldn't fail because it never predicted. It just responded. At the 5th kilometer, the march changed. Torvanin's voice carried back through the column. Double time. Maintain formation. The pace increased. The cadets' breathing roughened. Vesk felt his cardiovascular system shift into anaerobic output. The Ketharasi heart had 2 chambers, efficient at sustained low-intensity work but limited at peak demand, and the burn climbed through his chest and into his throat. A Rashini cadet dropped out at the 6-kilometer mark, simply sat down on the regolith and didn't get up. The drone arrived. The Rashini was not dismissed, she was carried, loaded onto a gravity sled that appeared from somewhere in the dark, and deposited at the endpoint while the column continued. Vesk kept moving, he was Ketharasi, endurance. But his spatial model had collapsed entirely. He was navigating by sound now, the footfalls of the cadet ahead of him, the rhythm of the column, the distant crunching of Torvanin's boots at the front. His secondary eyelids were sealed. His chemoreceptors were saturated with the collective stress output of 30 species. He was running blind, deaf to everything except the beat of his own blood and the mechanical insistence of his legs. And somewhere in the fog of oxygen debt and cognitive overload, a thought formed with the clarity of a signal flare. I am going to fall. A hand closed around his forearm. Not hard, not gentle, functional. 5 human fingers wrapped around the flat of his wrist, just above the chemoreceptor patch, with exactly the pressure needed to stabilize his stride without pulling him off balance. The grip lasted 3 seconds, long enough for Vesk's next 2 steps to find solid ground, long enough for his spatial model to reboot from the tactile anchor of the contact. And then it released. Marin didn't look at him. She was looking ahead, matching the column's pace, her breathing elevated but controlled. She had reached across the formation gap, steadied him, and withdrawn the hand in a single continuous motion that nobody else in the column could have seen in the dark. Vesk didn't fall. He finished the march. 29 of the 31 cadets finished the march. The 2 who didn't were not dismissed, they were carried to the endpoint and told to rest and be ready for the morning block. In the barracks afterward, in the dark, in the minutes before exhaustion dragged him under, Vesk lay in his bunk and felt the ghost of 5 human fingers on his wrist. The chemoreceptor patch was still reading the contact, a faint trace of human skin oils, sweat, salt, the chemical residue of a species whose hands were capable of building fires, shaping tools, writing symbols, and steadying a stranger's stride in the dark without breaking pace. The Ketharasi did not have a word for what the human had done. The closest approximation in Vesk's language was a compound term that translated roughly as noticing and acting without being asked, and it was considered a trait of mature officers, not cadets. She had not been taught it here. She had arrived with it already installed. Vesk endured the days that followed. He was Ketharasi. Endurance was what his species did. But he was not the same Ketharasi who had entered the proving. Something had changed in the architecture of his attention, and the change had a name: Bunk 411. He watched Kes Marin the way a student watches an instructor who is teaching without speaking. Not the content of the lessons, those he absorbed through the standard channels, but the form. The way the human calibrated her energy expenditure so precisely that she never exceeded her reserves and never fell below her baseline. The way she assessed every new challenge with the same quick practical scan, 3 seconds of observation, then action, no deliberation gap, no visible anxiety, no wasted motion. The way she treated the other cadets. This was the thing that Jorantai had missed, the thing his objection had not accounted for. Kes Marin did not practice being stone while the people around her broke. She noticed them. She noticed the Velasi whose mandible tremor returned during the 3rd-day field exercise and quietly repositioned herself in the formation so that the Velasi was shielded from the instructor's direct line of sight. She noticed the Grelian whose chromatophores were cycling toward panic white during the tactical theory exam and tapped his desk twice, a human gesture that carried no semantic content but that functioned, somehow, as a reset signal, breaking the cycle long enough for the Grelian to stabilize. She noticed the young Pelvori in the 4th-row bunks who had stopped eating and began sitting with him during meals, not speaking, just present, until the Pelvori started eating again on his own. She noticed Vesk. She noticed him noticing her, and she did not object to it, and she did not perform for it. She simply continued to be what she was: present, functional, calm, and let his observation serve whatever purpose it served. On the 4th day, the combatives' block arrived. Full contact, species unadjusted. The mat was a 10-meter circle of composite padding laid on the training yard deck, and the rules were the minimum necessary to prevent permanent injury. No strikes to primary sensory organs, no joint destructions past 1st degree, no weapons. Everything else was permissible. The pairings were random, or they were supposed to be random, but the algorithm had paired Kes Marin against Torek, a Tenthuri cadet who stood 2 heads taller than her and outmassed her by a factor of 3. Toric's species had evolved on a 1.6 gravity world with a dense atmosphere and an active predator ecology. His forearms were thicker than Marin's thighs. His center of gravity sat somewhere around her eye level. The formation ringed the mat. Vesk stood in the second row, his secondary eyelids sealed against the sharp outdoor light, his chemoreceptors picking up the distinct scent signature of the Tenthuri's pre-combat hormonal surge, a musk-heavy, almost metallic smell that signaled confidence and territorial assertion. Torek stepped onto the mat with the wide, planted stance of his species' natural fighting posture. Feet broad, arms slightly raised, head lowered to protect the neck. He looked at Marin the way heavy things look at light things, with the casual, pre-established certainty that mass would resolve the equation. Marin stepped onto the mat and did something Vesk had never seen a cadet do. She didn't set a stance. She didn't raise her guard. She stood with her feet shoulder-width apart and her arms loose at her sides, and she looked at Torek the way a surveyor looks at terrain measuring, reading, filing. The Druvan instructor called the start. Torek advanced. 3 heavy steps, closing the distance with the direct, overwhelming approach his species used in predator encounters, compress space, eliminate evasion options, bring mass to bear. His right arm came up in a sweeping strike aimed at Marin's torso, a blow that would have cracked the mandible housing of a Velisi or caved in the thoracic cavity of a Rashini. Marin stepped offline. 1 step. Her left foot pivoted, her body turned, and Torek's arm passed through the space where she had been, carrying his momentum past her and opening his right side. She hooked his elbow as it passed. Not grabbed, hooked, her fingers finding the gap between the Tenthuri's forearm plates where the joint articulated, the one spot on the arm where the dermal armor thinned to allow flexion. She pulled. Not with strength, she didn't have the strength. She pulled with timing, adding her vector to his, redirecting his own momentum into a rotation his balance couldn't compensate for. His right shoulder torqued. His planted foot slipped. And the Tenthuri, who outmassed her by a factor of 3, and who had entered the mat with the confidence of a species that had never evolved to worry about things smaller than itself, went down onto one knee with a sound like a deck plate buckling. His shoulder was dislocated, 1st degree, within the rules. The mat was silent. 30 cadets watching, Torvanin watching, the Druvan instructor watching with her mandibles absolutely still, which was the Druvan equivalent of holding one's breath. Marin stepped back. Her lip was split. Torek's initial advance had caught her with the edge of his forearm plate, a glancing blow she hadn't fully evaded. Blood red, human red, a color that didn't exist in Tenthuri biology, was running down her chin. She didn't wipe it. "Yield," Torek said from one knee, his good hand pressing his dislocated shoulder. There was no anger in his voice. There was the specific, bewildered recalibration of a predator who has just learned that the physics it relied on were incomplete. Marin nodded. She walked off the mat. She did not look at anyone. She went to the medical station and held still while the drone sealed her lip, and when the drone was finished, she walked back to the formation and stood at rest and waited for the next pairing. Her expression had not changed. That night in the refectory, Vesk spoke to her again. They were in the refectory, the same table, the same positions. The Velisi, Draensal, was sitting between them now, a deliberate choice on Draensal's part that Vesk recognized as species-typical proximity-seeking behavior. Draensal had attached herself to Kes Marin's orbit over the past 2 days, and the human had permitted it without comment. Jorantai said the Sieve teaches us not to respond to suffering, Vesk said. Marin ate her ration block, swallowed, drank, set the canister down. He was wrong. He was Keith Rossi. We are trained to observe patterns. He observed the pattern. He misidentified the lesson. She looked at Vesk directly. The Sieve doesn't teach you not to respond. It teaches you to choose your response. There's a difference. The cadets who broke during the first night, they were responding, reacting. The stress signal came in and their systems ran the default output. Wail, crack, cycle, flee, pure reflex. The Sieve strips away everyone who can't override the reflex. And the ones who stay. The ones who stay learn that the reflex is optional, that you can hear the person next to you breaking and choose to do something other than break alongside them. You can help. You can hold still. You can sleep. You can pick up someone's bag and hand it to them. The point isn't to stop feeling. The point is to feel it and choose what to do with it. She looked at him. The warm brown of her eyes caught the refectory's overhead light, and for a moment Vesk saw something in them that the calm usually hid: a depth, a weight, the sediment of experience that had settled so far below the surface that it was invisible unless the light hit it exactly right. "My world has a long history of training like this," she said. "Longer than most species in the Coalition. We've been refining it for thousands of years, breaking people down to build them back up. It works. But the version that works best isn't the one that teaches you to stop feeling. It's the one that teaches you to carry the feeling and keep moving." She finished her ration block. "Jorantai would have been a good officer," she said quietly. "He just wasn't ready to learn the hard version of the lesson." Vesk's secondary eyelids opened. All the way. The Ketharasi full exposure response, the one his species reserved for moments of unfiltered perception, no membrane between the eye and the world, no social shielding, no protective reflex. He was looking at her the way he had been looking at her since the first night, but now he understood what he was looking at. Not a mid-range endurance biped, not a moderate-strength primate with good thermoregulation, not a physiological profile assembled from briefing data and species summaries. A weapon that had been forged so long ago and so thoroughly that the forging itself was invisible. The Kethara Proving Grounds were trying to manufacture in 12 weeks what Earth had manufactured over 100,000 years. The capacity to be broken and reassembled, broken and reassembled, broken and reassembled, until the breaking itself became part of the structure, until the cracks were load-bearing. The Sieve was not testing Kes Marin. It was not even slowing her down. She was walking through it the way water walks through a riverbed, not because she was stronger than the stone, but because she had been doing this for so long that the path was already worn. 31 cadets remained after the Sieve. On the 5th day, the final assessment of the proving's opening phase arrived. Not a test, not a drill. A review, a formation review conducted by Senior Instructor Torvanen, and a panel of 3 officers from the Coalition's Training Directorate, who had arrived on a shuttle that morning and who now stood at the edge of the training yard in formal uniforms that looked sharply out of place against the raw composite deck and the pale blue sky. The panel was there to evaluate the proving's output. Every cadet knew it. The word had passed through the barracks in the chemical language of shared anxiety, pheromone traces, and subvocal murmurs, and the specific quality of silence that fills a room when everyone is thinking about the same thing, but nobody wants to be the first to say it. 31 cadets formed 4 ranks in the training yard. The pale sun threw hard shadows. The kinetic barrier hummed overhead. Vesk stood in the 2nd rank, his posture correct, his secondary eyelids open, his chemoreceptors reading the formation's collective chemical output and finding it qualitatively different from the first day's fear. It was sharper now, more focused, less like panic and more like readiness, the scent of organisms that had been compressed and tempered and were now waiting to learn whether the compression had held. Torvanen read the formation roster. 31 names called in intake order, each cadet responding with a spoken affirmative and holding position. 11 species represented: the Velasi who remained, the Rashini who had endured, the Kelshani, the Tenthuri, the Grelian, the Pelvori, the Ketharasi one where 3 had entered. And the human. Torvanen called her name last. Not because her intake number was last, it wasn't, but because the roster had been resequenced, and Vesk noticed the change and understood it immediately. Torvinen had reordered the list to end on the name that made the point he wanted the directorate panel to hear. Cadet Marin. Present Instructor. Her voice was steady, the same voice she had used on the first night, when she told Suvin that his crystal would crack if it rattled around loose. The same voice she had used in the refectory, when she told Vesk that the Sieve's lesson was not to stop feeling, but to carry the feeling and keep moving. A voice that contained no performance, no display, no attempt to project anything other than the bare fact of her presence. Torvinen closed the roster. He looked at the formation for a long time. Then he turned to the directorate panel and said something that Vesk would remember for the rest of his career. 47 cadets entered this intake cycle. 16 were dismissed during the Sieve. 12 species were represented at intake. The current formation comprises 11 species. He paused. One species in this formation has not lost a single recruit. The panel members exchanged a glance. One of them, a Kelshani officer with the rank insignia of a directorate assessor, tilted her elongated skull and said, "Which species?" Torvinen did not answer. He turned back to the formation and let his gaze travel across it, rank by rank, species by species, and then it stopped on the third rank, on the small figure standing between a Velasi and a Tenthuri, her uniform correct, her posture straight, her hands at her sides, her face carrying the same expression it had carried since intake. He did not say which one. He did not need to. The directorate assessor followed his gaze. Her prosthetic auditory slits adjusted. She looked at Kes Marin for a long enough that the silence in the formation acquired a physical quality, a weight that pressed against the ears and the chest. Then the assessor said quietly, "How many entered from that species?" "One," Torvinen said. The yard was silent. The pale blue sun threw hard shadows across the composite deck. 31 cadets stood in formation and breathed and waited, and the silence was not the silence of the Sieve, not the silence of fear, not the silence of endurance, not the silence of people holding themselves together against the pressure. It was the silence of recognition, the specific, institutional silence that fills a room when the data has spoken and the conclusion is self-evident, and the only appropriate response is to let it land. One species, one recruit, 0 losses. Vesk felt the wonder settle into his bones, the way heat settles into metal slowly, deeply, changing the molecular structure of the thing it enters. He looked at Kes Marin. Her face had not changed. Her posture had not shifted. She was standing in the third rank, breathing evenly, her dark eyes fixed on the middle distance with the focused neutrality of someone who had already moved past this moment and was thinking about the next one. The praise, if it was praise, had not reached her. Or it had reached her and she had processed it and set it down, the way you set down a tool you've finished using, with no sentiment attached. She was not performing humility. She was not suppressing pride. She was simply present the same way she had been present on the first night when the Velasi broke and the Druvan cracked and the Vorethi twins left arm in arm. The same way she had been present during the march when Vesk's legs had started to go, and 5 fingers had closed around his wrist and steadied him without a word. The human did not react to the silence. She did not need to. The silence was not about her. It was about everyone else in the formation, the 30 other cadets who were each, in their own way, recalibrating something fundamental about what they thought they knew about species and strength and the cost of becoming something the galaxy needed. Torvinen dismissed the formation. The cadets broke ranks. The directorate panel walked to their shuttle. The pale blue sun continued its transit across the thin sky. And Vesk Tolenrai, Keith Rossi, station-born, 11 generations of officers in his lineage, the only one of his species to survive the Sieve, stood in the emptying yard and understood that the education he had come here for was not the one he was receiving. The curriculum was in the classrooms and the training yard and the tactical theory blocks. It was in Torvinen's flat voice, and the Druvan instructor's notched mandibles and the directorate assessor's quiet question. But the education, the real one, the one that had reached into the architecture of his thinking and rearranged its load-bearing walls, that education was in bunk 411. It was small and unarmored and impossible to predict. And it had been sleeping soundly, while the rest of them learned what it meant to be afraid.